Hello and welcome to Varn Blog. And today we're going to be talking about a bunch of issues that inform and limit the way the left thinks about itself. And I should stop saying the left because that's almost an empty signifier. So what exactly that means, we could mean anything from Democrat to Marxist to anti-left Marxist to positions themselves as the true communist while this other side is the left of capital. There's all kinds of word games you can play to make yourself feel good at the end of the day. But for the most part, they are historical relics. This is not to say the left has no meaning. When someone says beyond left and right, they generally mean right. But it is something to think about. I've been wondering why I'm constantly asked, of all the areas of reactionary politics that I'm asked to comment on, I'm generally asked to comment the most on the most marginal figures. Third and fourth positionism is interesting in so much that it sometimes rhymes with more popular forms of leftism. But beyond that, it's not really a meaningful category. When I say it's not really a meaningful category, it does not mean that these people don't exist, and in some places, such as Europe, are not actually growing in popularity. But when you ask yourself in the US where the danger is not in some dipshit on the internet who pretends they're Francis Parker Yockey. I had to think about why this was the case. Why were people always asking me to talk about the marginal figures? You know, why were they not looking at the more immediate, larger threats in their lives? The political threats, real ones. Why did we have to make a marginal figure like Richard Spencer a household name for a few years just so he could tear himself down? I have no sympathy for the man. He got what he deserved. That's not my point. But yes, we did. You who continued in left-wing discourse, who fed into liberal discourse, totally did. You who look at politics as a spectator sport did. Do not absolve yourself. Do not absolve yourself. You continued to participate. How many of you voted for Biden? Be honest. Yeah, I don't want you to tell me. You have the right to keep that on your conscience. But I know a lot of people who told me they voted for Biden and immediately started regretting their decision. These are the same people who were afraid of Trump and then told me we shouldn't have been. Again, conscience. The reason why we look at these third and fourth positionists is because they rhyme with ourselves. They're marginal. Many of the figures are actually pathetic if you read their history. Their ideas are only influential if they are picked up by more feasible actors, but the feasible actors they are picked up by are generally not that competent. Bannon was not a competent political actor, and frankly, neither is AOC, other than anything than building their own media lens. And yet, this is always there to keep you aligned to the Democrats. And if they're not, it's just like the way the throwing the word Marxist around will keep, boomer and Gen X yahoos aligned to the Republicans. And the idea that this is a spectacle being controlled by corporations is actually somewhat, again, hopeful. It would imply that there's some adult in the room actually running all this. I assure you there isn't. The more I meet of elites, the more I realize how little we know of them, and by little, how unimpressive they are. So we look at people like Francis Parkiyaki. I bring that up because he was a person that was somewhat immortalized by Kevin Coogan's book, Dreamer of the Day. He was also a favorite of like the 90s fascist movement. Now, there's some people here who are going to pretend like there's a massive working class for you to align with against the quote PMC unquote. And they'll bring up people who don't even believe in the PMC thesis because they're cynical actors. And you know who I'm talking about. But we do have to look at something. I was asked, what did I agree with Michael Lind on? Michael Lind is trying to create some kind of center rightish, maybe corporatist. And by corporatist, I mean this in the old sense of the term. I do not mean rule by corporations. I mean a corporate class collaborationist state that will mitigate the tensions between the petite bourgeois and the professional class. And he separates those out. I mean, his class diagram is actually closer to mine on the intermediary classes. What is interesting is he views both the working class and the bourgeoisie, the rich bourgeoisie, as largely out of the political game. What you see when you look at what he says, though, is that the democratic politics is aligned around professionals who are a couple of different class strata. He identifies them as a class, but most liberal and conservative sociology doesn't have a consistent definition for what a class is. Sometimes it's defined by income, sometimes it's defined by function. Lind does both. It is not defined by relationship to value, which is only the way Marx defines it in terms of capital. And Marx's ultimate definition of class is power over division of labor. But regardless, let's look at this objectively. But there's some other key facts that both the Jacobin left and the Bellows anti-left and even some of these guys are not looking at. One, despite the focus on the PMC, that the actual wealthy donors get pretty much what they want from both parties, regardless of what the educated elites say. So where I disagree with Lind is Lind sees the bourgeoisie as an inactive strata, and I don't. They pay for things. Now, who's actually running their businesses is another matter entirely. And actually, the difference between the PMC thesis and what Michael Lind spells out, and again, Lind and I have different politics, but in this, I think he's correct. And this is why I reject the PMC thesis. There's a strata of professionals, about 60% of whom are dependent on the state. There's a strata of true elites, top 10% of their field and with fiduciary responsibility, etc. And these true elites alternate who they support. They're the people who manage the money of a lot of the bourgeoisie. If there is someone other than the bourgeoisie, the actual owners of capital, because who make the active decisions, it is this class. And the reason why is bourgeois power is diffuse. The age of the entrepreneurial individual owner of capital is largely gone. Diffuse liability also meant diffuse ownership. In most cases, yes, there are still old money capitalists, and they still actually dominate a lot more than people realize. I mean, they make up a lot of our public institutions. We talk about the political families. Most of the political families that dominated the GOP in particular until literally the last decade were these old families, were the remnants. They're the Bushes. They're the Adamses. They're the people who go back to the founding of the country. They're the Rockefellers, yes. There was kind of an insurrection against them. The first one being Goldwater, the second being Reagan, the third being Trump. But Trump is probably the furthest removed from the old money. Now, the Southern Republican Party was very different. The Southern Republican Party was built off the Sun Belt rich, but they were nouveau riche in comparison. Mostly new money and increasingly petty bourgeois. These are your Purdue's, your Tysons, the names of chicken factories, the names of the Koch brothers. Different group of people. The old aristocracy of the South was tied to the Democratic Party until it basically had to recognize the dominance of the new money conservatives. In the 90s, that's when that happened. It wasn't even during Nixon's Southern strategy. That was not completed until the end of the 90s in the George W. Bush administration. The question becomes, why are we focusing on these marginal figures? Sure, they might infiltrate our movements, and we have to deal with that. That is for us to do and for us to do privately, but why talk about it publicly so much? Why get caught up in a liberal push for a popular front? Because I've heard it justified over and over. There's people in my comment section right now who tell me that I was wrong to say that the whole time what you're getting right now was going to be a result of that. That there was going to be a problem with this popular front strategy because we weren't building our own institutions. We were parasiting the others. So we would have to defend those institutions that made them stronger because they had more of the institutional power to continue. And as a result of that, we're also not looking at the actual base of what the working class is in America. You can go back to the new manager class. You can look at the managerial thesis by James Burnham, the administrative thesis by the Frankfurt School, particularly Frederick Pollock, the Sweezyite ideologies about managerial capital. None of these are new. These came to being in a time period of Fordism. And it's interesting that they're coming back now because we are not in a Fordist moment. But while a lot of the academics and scholars in their prestidigitation of language have pretended that neoliberalism and Fordism were completely different modes, completely different modes of being, there's a continuity between neo-Fordism and neoliberalism that only Philip Murawski is one of the only people I've known who's really done a good job of making this very clear. That the profitability crises, which a lot of people in the MMT circles like to deny were a thing because they think money and the liquidity of money is the same as the value it produces. Whatever critiques they have of Marx, and there's many legitimate ones they have historically, and I could go into that if you want me to at another time. But this, I think, is where the rubber meets the road. Fordism was a way to reinvest labor into the project of capital itself. But it was fatal. What do I mean by that? Well, it led to high investment yields, but you saw a negative trajectory of profits. I'm not even arguing off of some abstract tendency of rate of profit to fall as per capital, because it's not clearly stated in capital. It's something you can look at. Profitability declined, financialization kicked in, profitability returned, and then accelerated downward. The other story, as presented by most Keynesians, is actually that financialization was a political project and profitability decline because of financialization. But there's almost no evidence for it in either the standard liberal story or in Marxist economics. Why does this matter? Why is this important? To get back to what I agree with Michael Lind about. This fundamentally changed, it finished changing the nature of the working class in America and in most of the world. See, this is where I differ from like third worldists. This change is happening across the globe. It is not just happening in developed capital. Reinvestment, instead of going back into R&D and to the government, which was doing indirect investment for a lot of these firms, started going straight into hoarding of revenues. Distrust in certain kinds of investment increased dramatically, while paper assets also became far more common. This led to a massive increase in automation. It was already happening. It had been happening, and people wanted it. And I don't just mean like the employers wanted it. Everybody wanted it. Grueling labor sucks. Now, according to classical LVT, this should decline profit rates. I'm not going to make that argument. I don't know that I could prove it. I suspect it's true, but I don't think I could prove it. But one thing I have noticed, and this is totally in line with Aaron Benyanev's research on automation, is that the size of the industrial working class worldwide is declining, even though the proportion of the economy involved in manufacturing, while decreasing, is nowhere decreasing nearly as fast as the amount of people involved in that labor. At least when adjusted for population size. This is important for understanding where I agree with Michael Lind. The industrial working class and manufacturing in the United States is at absolute most 9% of the non-farm workforce, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Now, if you're trying to appeal to that as a kind of democratic base for a workers' revolution, you're utterly boned. 9%. Now, when you add the agricultural laborers who are not employees, it's less than 1%. So you have small farm owners. I think it's like small farm owners. It's a percentage of agriculture. It's about 60%, but agriculture is about 2% of the overall economic output. And yes, it varies by region because population and resources vary by region. So you should quit trying to make excuses for yourself, all right, on these regional variances. Doesn't get you out of the problem. No, they're not huge amounts of production workers. They're at most 25%. I've actually looked it up. So again, no, you are making stuff up. These are copes. Stop it. And in those areas where there are production, they're declining because they need less and less of a workforce. So even in areas where industrial production is at 30%, which is about the highest I found in the United States, again, you can't base off of just that. And that's not true for any given state. That's only true for certain regions of certain states. The projection is, while the raw number of needed is going to increase, its percentage of the overall economy will continue to decline indefinitely. Quit reaching for copes. It's annoying. Less of the problem where if you were never committed to Marx's idea that only the industrial worker were the agents of history, though. That's not Marx's idea, JM. The exact wording was only the proletariat is the agent of history, and the proletariat is historically specific. So if you're gonna like say we have problems with Marx, it's better to articulate what he actually says. The problem that you have is not that Marx's idea of revolution was totally dependent on only the industrial worker. The problem that you have is that sectoral divisions amongst workers has increased, and those divisions are not false consciousness, they're real. This is another thing where I agree with Michael Lind. Since the 1960s, the percentage of the workforce that is in in white collar or service sector work is it's been above 50% since the late 60s. Meaning that in no place on earth was the industrial proletariat in manufacturing ever the majority of the population. Anywhere. No, it isn't, J.M. Colon. He actually talks about this in Theories of Surplus Value and Capital, Volume 2. Again, it would help if you actually read it, instead of relying on what your MMT friends say. He does reject peasants because they own land. The issue is ownership, not oppression, but ownership and your ability to maintain the privileges of ownership. When Marx talks in Theories of Surplus Value, he actually talks about socially necessary labor, those who contribute to value beyond the production of direct commodities. It's part of the circuit of capital, which is almost everything. What is socially necessary varies on the teleos of society, but the teleos of capital is commodity production. However, there are other socially necessary functions. So one is productive to capital, and this is not a good in and of itself. Again, see Theories of Surplus Value and Capital Volume 2. And what is socially necessary may not be productive towards capital. But none of you have found anything other than riots to get yourself out of this situation. Have you read Theories of Surplus Value, which modifies Capital Volume 2? Yes or no? If you have not, shut up. Your counter assertion is meaningless. He excludes lawyers and civil servants because they're explicitly wards of the state, thus tied into a state. And if they're not wards of the state, they're petty bourgeois. But here's the problem with Marx's theories here, because I'm going to just continue what I think the issue is. My issue is not... Keith. I'm just going to take care of this right now. If we ask ourselves why we focus on weirdos, it's because if we are honest, we don't know how to deal with this problem. What is the problem? Draw a line. You have a massive service sector proletariat. It's proletariat in that it doesn't own a lot. It doesn't own its own capital. It's dependent on wages, so it's dependent on the general wage fund. However, the traditional ways of organizing them don't work. Union negotiations are better when you're dealing with a single site employer. And in the case of most service sectors, you're not. Franchising completely makes that way more difficult under both formal and informal context. Okay, JM makes a point. Which is simplified. Calling peasants petit bourgeois because they own land misses the point. I don't think they're all petit bourgeois. It controls who owns productive forces and claims on surplus. For most peasants, that's the landlords. Totally true. It's rentier economies. However, we don't really have peasants anymore. Not in the core, and increasingly, not even in the developing world. Over 60% of the world's population is in urban areas now. The difference between petit bourgeois and peasants historically is petit bourgeois own their own means of production beyond the raw the raw product of the land which they cultivate. Right? It's kind of a weird distinction. I'm not sure that it actually holds, but even Marx didn't talk about peasants and petit bourgeois interchangeably. Most 6% of U.S. farms are now corporations, according to the USDA ERS. Let's see. A majority of U.S. land and farm is owner-operated, just 60%. The national share of farmland owner-operated has been relatively stable over the past 50 years. But owner operation is actually kind of not what I'm looking at. That's a distorted statistic. Non-operator landlords are more likely than operator landlords to acquire land through inheritance. Most landlords belong to blah, blah, blah. So tenant farming's So when we talk about peasants or even agrarian wage labor, I mean, like, you're actually looking at about 2% of the U.S. economy. Food production is hugely important, but a very small role is involved in it. Actually, Bordiga, of all people, predicted this would be the case. I should not read the... So the situation is that you have no real means, obviously, to build a workers' party off of the traditional way to do it, which is a coalition of unions. That is both legally prescribed from you, and the way you would build those unions in the United States is unclear. Depending on what I look at, the stats on how much percentage of the American workforce is in unions is between 12 and 17%. I don't know why there's such a variance. And most of that is public sector. And a lot of that is educated public sector. All right. We'll be in touch, Cullen, on theories of surplus value. So the problem with the Marxist assumption that we've had is that it was always assumed that the proletariat would be the majority of the population eventually. And if you define the proletariat as people who are dependent on the wage fund, then yes, it's something like 80% of the population. However, the range of both wealth and income in that set is huge. However, if you look to traditional ties into commodity production, you're down to, even if you include all agricultural labor, you're down to something like 13% of the population, with areas like the Southeast and Midwest maybe being in the upper, maybe approaching 40%. But those areas being very low population. Why am I talking about this to you? Well, the PMC thesis, which again, I think flattens things out too much, does get into the problem that there is a P, there are professional strata of managers. That's one thing. And true elites with fiscal responsibility. That's how Aldous Reed defines the PMC. There are professionals who are knowledge workers. Peasants don't exist anymore. Who are knowledge workers? They're about, I don't know, that how that's defined is weird. I remember that that Graeber, for example, took every job that required any form of education and said that it was all part of the professional strata. That was David Graeber. So he defined that as up to 60% of the population. That doesn't seem true. Partly because jobs that required education have changed. So jobs that didn't used to require an education now now don't, or now do, excuse me. I'm trying to follow your dumb argument. So what do I mean by that? I can just give you a couple of anecdotes. I just spelled into Southernism. You used to be able to work at a insurance company with a high school education. That's about it. You go take the company would pay for a course to pass your insurance license, and you go. And increasingly those jobs have required a higher level degree set over the past 20 years. And I know because I worked in it when they started changing the requirements. So my bosses didn't have the education of the people coming in with me. This trend has been across the board. This is going to bring me to something else that's going to make people uncomfortable. When you ask yourself, why does every social democratic thing assume that like the kind of upper middle class life that a lot of people are Protestant or in urban areas will be what life looks like in a socialist society? Why do we always push, for example, universal free college education as a means for jobs? In a weird way, it's the same logic that the neoliberals who push for increased education, but not universal and not free, were doing. And yet it wasn't looking at why jobs were using education as a marker. And that was what? It was a limit on applicant pools. The scarcity of education was the point. Yes, you do need actually educated people for very specific technical skills. And yes, that requires education. But to get a general humanities education as a blocker for job entry, which it kind of was, because a lot of these jobs that require degrees don't require, they didn't require specific degrees. What specific degree do you need to be a manager? What specific degree do you need to take an insurance test? You need to be literate. You need to have basic computer skills, but that's it. It was a way of limiting the application pool. That benefit goes away once you universalize it. So unless you really believe that the skills will be required, you're creating a very highly educated population for jobs that there aren't going to be enough of. I don't say that to be cruel. I don't say that to say that we shouldn't value education, but I'm going to get into that in a minute too. And you're doing it by making it free on an apparatus that would expand a certain administrative criterion that is huge. In this, I also see Michael Lynn's point there. What do I mean? By expanding, if you try to have all people actually inter-educate, there's two ways you can handle universal education. The way most countries handle it is public universities, not most countries, but a lot of countries, public universities were free in a lot of the developed world, not in the United States, but they were. And in those areas, the free universities are actually usually the providence of the rich. Why? Because they're elite. There's only so many spaces. They're free. Therefore, there's high competition to get them. And the rich have the advantage. That is what you see in a lot of Europe. And that is what you see in Asia. What's the root cause of an uptick in credentialization? One was a change in the nature of work from semi-skilled physical labor to semi-skilled mental labor. The other was the raw number of applicants as population size increased. Right? So while there are more people needing more things and needing more work, the raw number of people who want a kind of job that is semi-skilled now has to be arbitrarily curtailed. It was kind of arbitrary. The importance of universities have led this medieval institution whose sins of its medievalism is mainly in the way it organizes its faculty, but its main drain on society is not the faculty. And this does not stop with higher education either. And I'm going to get into this in a minute. So why do you focus on these marginal issues? Because you feel like you can actually do something about it. This stuff, you go free education. Well, you haven't thought that through. I'm all about free. If you want to give college this tomorrow, I would massively benefit. Trust me. I do not know why you won't, that we're only talking about from a reformist standpoint, for example. There's kind of a bait and switch where you get nothing or we get total college debt relief. And like, you can't even ask for things like, well, why is the interest at 8% when you're dealing with things the size of a home loan? Just the forgiveness of interest alone would be massive. Why were there pay-as-you-go things legal that made it to where you could owe more money than you took out after 5 or 6 years because you weren't even paying all the interest? Why was that allowed? It was definitely allowed, I know. Yet we play this game, and the socialists involved in electoral politics are participants in this game. They posit something radical, you don't get it, and you don't even get now the intermediate compromise position because it's not even on the table. They don't even try. Yeah, they go to public colleges because they have the best faculty. The reason why they have the best faculty is not because they're free. It's just because they're elite. They're all tied in together. There is scarcity there. You are not dealing with something that produces a commodity. So any of your LVT notions don't apply to education. Furthermore, senior faculty actually don't benefit that much from that. Admin do. But even then, that's not who's getting it. It's the 8% is not going to the universities. It's going into bankers' coffers. There's a lot of conservatives and a lot of liberals who want you to get distracted by culture war bullshit. And we have been for a long time. But a lot of what people have posited as an answer to that is also bullshit. It's just not true. There's no large blue-collar working class in most of the country with most of the population for you to appeal to. There just is not. There's a service sector in a variety of sectors. The largest single sector in the United States of work, of labor, is probably trucking. After that, it's actually public institutions and then Walmart. But the public institutions are also strangely run. And I was about to get into that too. What are the problems with this talk about free education without massive educational reform? Is that you would not be empowering institutions that empower education. You'd be empowering administrators to get better off. Relatively speaking, you. Do you have a thing for student loans in the U.S. where you only pay after you're making a certain amount in the country? You do have income-based repayment, but usually you're paying something no matter what. Does the debt go away after 47? No, it does not. The debt does not go away until you die. Truckers are mostly unionized. They are. But truckers are also petit bourgeois. Not all of them. I actually need to look at the percentage. I think it's something like 40 and 60. But the thing is, it's also a field that we don't really want to be that huge. So if you were to invest a ton of money into, I was about to say, I think it's like 60% non-owner operated or something, but it's hard to say. I know, does student debt pound down to? No, it does not. It dies with the person. So unlike other forms of debt, it doesn't pass on to the estate. And to pass on to the estate is not the same as like passing on to a specific person. Usually, if it liquidates the estate, it doesn't go on to children. It can go on to a spouse if they are named in the estate, but sometimes the estate can just be liquidated and that ends it. But in regards to student debt is till death of the person, but it doesn't catch on to the estate. And we're wait till we have self-driving cars, and we're going to. I mean, the trucking industry is about to collapse. I think everyone's known it for a long time. So why you're always reaching for the thing that was a week ago. Partly because a lot of you don't want to engage with conventional forms of information. You deal with infotainment, or you deal with left-wing sources. I've been reading Jacobin that would make you think that there's a large industrial workforce just waiting to be leftified. Where's it at? So those are the realities of the situation, folks. So to get back to Michael Lynn's right that the petit bourgeois feels squeezed, and that's where they're afraid of taxes, and that's where they're becoming more and more reactionary. They are not an insignificant size of the population. If you were to look at like self-identified conservatives, they would probably be see small business owners as percentage of workforce. Let me just check it. So small business owners as a percentage of the workforce. Something like, well, no, these are small businesses and their employees of less than 100 is 47% of the U.S. workforce. Yes, I can. This E minor says, can you see the Republicans, at least in rhetoric, attacking the self-driving trucking? I can. I also see them doing nothing about it, just using it as a rhetorical thing against elites. The last election kind of made the class analysis that Michael Lynn was pushing seem not as far off to me. Now, I'll tell you where I told you why I disagree with him. He sees the bourgeois as neutral, and he sees the working class as neutral. The actual working class, and he defines that differently from us. The actual working class, according to him, would be something like service sector workers, blue collar workers, and anything that doesn't require an education. Like you see with J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance has talks about elites, but he has people in that elite who are poor. By the way, the average manufacturing worker on aggregate makes $80,000 a year. The average worker in America, what's the average income right now per person? Because that's a per person average. The average worker in America makes $68,000 per year. It probably does, because the actual percentage of non-managers and labor is probably a lot less. The average programmer in America makes $120,000 a year. And again, these are median averages, assuming about 10 years of work. I'm sure it's 80,000. I just looked it up. In fact, actually, it's U.S. manufacturing based off the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The average manufacturing worker makes $88,000 a year. That is $20,000 more than the average worker, because manufacturing worker is no longer semi-skilled. That's mostly been taken up by robots. Now, this needs to be adjusted for areas like the Deep South, where things go down pretty dramatically. But still, even when you adjust for PPP, it's pretty high. Compare that in regions where with those jobs, like the areas that are also where there's a lot of manufacturing jobs that pay okay, when they are replaced with something else like Amazon warehouses or Walmart. Well, Amazon tends to pay better than Walmart, but neither one of them hit anything like the manufacturing sector do. The median household income is $68,000 a year. I said that. So that's just according to the census. It's gone up $20K from inflation in the past 20 years. It was like $48,000 when I graduated from high school. So most socialist policies address this only in so much that they address healthcare. But healthcare in the United States is hard to reform, and it's hard to reform for reasons that are obvious. If you got rid of non-essential healthcare labor, so people who don't actually serve patients, how much of the workforce in healthcare would be immediately unemployed? Bernie Sanders actually did talk about this, and he talked about creating this massive concierge service out of that unemployed amount of clerical labor in the healthcare sector that's created by administrative bloat, frankly. But in a lot of parts of the country, if you've lost manufacturing, and a lot of the South that doesn't have these manufacturing plants have, and this is true for the Midwest too. Yeah, you guys are confusing average household income with average starting wage. Those are very different things. Usually the average yearly income is going to be, on a starting salary, is going to be a fourth to half of, depends on what the various scales are. For example, the average teacher in the United States makes $50,000 a year. The average private school teacher makes $36,000 a year. Oh, it's funny. I was reading conservatives using this to argue that they pay public school teachers too much, and I was like, if everyone in the all teachers made $36,000 a year, it'd be an unviable profession. There's a bunch of issues. Employer union healthcare has been hurt though by Obamacare. I mean, they've been let me see what I got here. Oh yeah, medium household income. You're right. It's not average earned income. The 38,000 is average worker income in the field. I mean, that seems me. You guys are getting me confused with throwing numbers out. Stop. You guys stop it. The median household income is 68,000. The average. The median, yeah. The average manufacturing income for a worker in manufacturing is 88,000, which is 20,000 higher than household income. But that is average, and it doesn't break down management from non-management, so I cannot tell you what positions people are working. The average wage is only 10K lower than the average income, and that's weird. So let's look at that. The average yearly wage is for full-time men is 47, and for full-time work, is 57, which is only 10,000 than the average household. The average full-time median wage for a woman is 10K less than that at 47,000. The difference in household income would be explained by the number of single mothers. That's what the census says. So I'll even put it in the forum for you. I found this on Policy Advice on Insurance. That's what the census says. The statistics, however, would be distorted. Because remember, high income earners are going to raise that up, and low income earners are going to drop it down. So the median is going to probably be disproportionately brought up by the fact that we have a fairly high Gini coefficient. All I'm saying is the focus on the blue collar, on the manufacturing worker, depending on what level of worker you're talking about, and I can't find those stats easily, is significantly higher than the average proletariat. It just is. Furthermore, let's talk about party affiliation for a second. So this was I looked at this last time based on exit polls. So income average for Democrats. And this is from 2020. An individual likelihood of being a Democrat decreases with every additional hour he or she earns. Democrats have a huge advantage, 63%, with voters earning less than $15,000 per year. However, this changes with the ultra wealthy. While Democrats lose support as income increases, they also seems to be a tipping point where the ultimate world will begin leaning Democratic. The famous example would be the entertainment industry example. So when I looked at the split from, this is from debt.org, but when I looked at the split right after the election on the income of voters for Biden, the Democratic vote tended to be under 80,000 and over 200,000. So there is a sense in which partisan affiliation in the United States is classed with the Democrats being the party of both the completely non-privileged and the most privileged. For example, in education, that's according to debt.org stats, and I'll put this if you want to find my source. Democrats support labor unions in higher numbers than Republicans. 2/3 of Americans agree that the statements that labor unions are necessary, blah, blah, blah. Excuse me. There are two distinct levels of education amongst Democrats, those without a high school diploma and those with a postgraduate degree. So most high school graduates who do not get some postgraduate education tend to be Republican. Republicans gain their majority support from high school graduates, individuals with some college, and with low-earning college graduates. Now, that's an interesting thing. Now, we can't deduce, because we don't ask people on exit polls what they do for a living in a way that would make it a clear class marker. But I suspect you would find that Lynn's description of the petite bourgeois and certain strata of the managerial class who are not in urban areas, so the Sunbelt rich, the Sunbelt lawyers, etc., are moving, tend to be Republicans. Now, what does this mean for us? The problem that the left would seem to have is that from the cultural perspective of worker, the worker would seem, if they aren't in urban areas, to be Republicans. But that's a cultural definition. It's hard to say because our stats are strange what that actually means. And I've lost a lot of people on this one, but there's other interesting stats if you want to look at this on the way that this actually plays out in regards to rural-urban divide. On race, 85% of the Republican Party is white, although it has a growing support base amongst Latinos and Asians. What's interesting with Democrats is that black support of the Democratic Party does not change by social class. Latinos, they use Hispanics, but I'm using a different word. Latinos, the fastest growing ethnic group in the United States, also tend to support Democrats, voting for them 60 to 70% of the time. But unlike African American support, a Latino voter support is more likely to be affected by either income or location than by race. So you have a weird coalition in the Democratic Party, people. Excuse me, the statistic I said that did include benefits in their wage costs. So the average worker in all non-farm industries earns $71,000. when you include benefits cost. And I didn't see that they were including benefits in that, but it's still 10K, it's 13K more. The average manufacturing worker earned more than $29.77 per hour in July, not including benefits. And for production and for non-supervising workers, the average wage is $24 or 23.86. This represents an increase of 4% increase over July 2020 for production non-supervisory employees. The stats are important. I would suspect that there would be no reliable data on the children of undocumented families because people would be hesitant to admit that. So what's my... No, my point is actually that there aren't a lot of necessary... We don't know if the workers are conservative or not. From everything I can tell, when you look at Pew data, that the working class, even in the year of hyper voting, which was what 2020 was, that the working class is still not super likely to vote. That did decrease dramatically in the year of mail-in elections. And while it did favor Democrats, not as much as people would have thought. It is impossible to generalize, in my opinion, about how the worker in America will vote. There is a sense in which a lot of people in the working class tend, if they do vote for who's most popular. The Pew polls are somewhat useful. Yeah. What's interesting is, well, the numbers are different from what the Bureau of Labor Statistics put out because the Bureau of Labor Statistics probably did not include benefits in their number. And no, we cannot draw a Dem vote as fully non-conservative because social conservative values are actually still tracked to religiosity. And while the average Democrat is less religious, that is not necessarily true for the average Black Democrat. And I don't mean to speak so directly, but religiosity in the African American community is higher than in the white community. I don't have good stats on that because I don't tend to ask people on exit polls if they vote repeatedly. Yeah, benefits are calculated in, although the benefits are only accounting for an additional... Let's see. Let me look at this. This is why I'm actually glad you guys have me share these sources because they're misleading. The benefits are accounting for an additional it looks like $18,000 a year. Yeah, I don't know about temp being included. Okay. I'm going to just say nice things about the fact that I really wish people would stop mentioning small nations with populations smaller than a state as models for the U.S. It's... Oh, yeah. how are they defining the term? And what are you even like the average for what? Okay, looking at the Bureau of Labor Statistics for manufacturing, NICICS. So union membership, by the way, in manufacturing has declined. Members of unions' percentage of wage and salary work in the manufacturing sector, as laid by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. In 2017, it was 9.1%. In 2018, it was 9%. In 2019, it was 8.6%. In 2020, it was 8.5%. So it looks like the majority of the increase in unionization is in non-manufacturing areas as a percentage. That's worrying. Where's the average earnings? Average hourly earnings for manufacturer, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, actually is the same as what is listed on that site, and it is $29 per hour. If you factor out management or hours of production and non-supervisory employees, the average salary is $23.60. Average working hours per week being 41. But this is interesting. The median versus the mean. Helpers and production workers, the mean average, the median is 31, the mean is 32. Inspectors, testers, setters, and sorters, 40, 44, 45, 76. Purchasing agents, except hotel, resort, and farm purchasing agents, looks like it's inflating it, 66 to 70,000 a year, and then team assemblers, 35. So yeah, it's actually quite low. So what did we just learn? We just learned that even when you look at the figures, things are worse than they seem, and also hard to completely understand. So when we break down that income claim of 88,000 and look at who gets it, it looks like it's mostly purchasing agents are the only non-management driving that up. Temps are not included from what I can see here. Healthcare is. So. The gig economy situation is even harder to trace. And for a variety of reasons, but let's just say, let's look at average yearly income of Uber driver. I'm just picking a company because I might be able to find it. Driver US. See, now this is interesting. So according to Glassdoor, I can't find anything in Bureau of Labor Statistics that specific. So according to Glassdoor, the average Uber driver makes a pay base of $40K a year, which I find hard to believe. But according to Glassdoor as well, that the range of possible compensation is between 24K and 64. I don't know how you'd make 64K. No one stays in the field long enough for it to be meaningful, so it's hard to say how you'd even get that. Given that it would be filed under, I think in most states you'd be self-employed as a gig, so I have no idea how you'd even look at it. So what have we seen here? We've seen that pay is wildly variant within industries, even amongst people who are technically employees and not even management. We have seen that union membership may be increasing, but not amongst people in manufacturing. It's actually on a mild decline. We have seen that overwhelmingly most of the union employees in the United States, and I've talked about this over and over again, are in the public sector. We have seen that the Democratic Party is a coalition of the very poor and the very well off. We've seen that what predicts where you're likely to vote is your education, not your income level entirely. And we have seen that working class people don't really vote. We've also seen that trying to give free education without massively reforming the education system would be a gift to administrators of a massive scale. We have seen that the way it would be structured would often lead to things like elite capture of free resources, or if not, the massive devaluation of the degree itself. Guys, peeps, how does any of this confirm to the socialist strategies you've been seeing coming out of the DSA or the way people have been talking about with the Democrats? And I've already addressed this because you guys apparently don't keep up. The 88,000 is according to the manufacturers, it is including supervisor pay and all benefits. If you look on the Bureau of Labor Statistics page, you won't find that. However, if you look at what they cite for individual earners, and it matches with what the Bureau of Labor Statistics says. What's distorting it is the inclusion of management and the inclusion of benefits in the average pay. However, if you include benefits for the average worker in the United States, it is still lower in aggregate, but not for each part of the manufacturing process, which again is distorting. This is not my point. My point is not, are any socialists dealing with disabilities? Most socialists are college students playing around on Twitter. Are people who, frankly, are approaching their 30s and have never had a job. Furthermore, if you look at the way that even some of these reform things are going to be used as a constant voter-based reframe, I mean, it's unclear to me if the conservatives have shot themselves in the foot by the Texas law and actually delivering on their false promise, This is going to be unlistenable afterwards. But the reason why this is important. Okay. Do you know what percentage of teachers are in teachers' unions? Percentage of teachers in teachers' unions. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, percentage of the workforce in unions or employee associations is 72.5%. No, okay, so yeah, 72.7%, and I'll post this for you. But this was in 2015, 2016. Percentage of, but they're also including, they're not just including unions, they're also including employee associations. Let me find the actual. Okay, this is from Ed Week. I'm always sending these to you. This is in 2019. Participation in teachers' unions is actually down and likely to tumble further. The percentage of U.S. public school teachers participating in unions has been declining steadily over the last 2 decades, and the numbers are soon likely to have an even steeper dive. COVID didn't seem to change this, which is worrying. About 70% of teachers participate in unions or employee associations, according to federal data. This is down from 74% in 2012. Teachers' unions. All right, so about 75% of the teachers in suburban schools join unions, only compared to about 62% in rural schools. Schools between 200 and 400 students have a greater percentage of students per teacher participating in unions, and schools that are larger are smaller. And teachers in more affluent schools, which is less than a third qualified for free reduced lunch, are slightly more likely than their peers to join a labor group. So the teachers who you would really want to be in a union, according to Ed Week, who is basing their stats off of the ones I just looked at, are the teachers slightly less likely to be so. This is even more true with charter schools, which is only 28% unionized, according to the EdStat statistic. Now, none of these seem updated for 2020 data. This does not include the fact that a lot of teachers' unions are in states where it's wait till I get to you. Part of the issue is some of these states, the schools are closed shop. The idea that you're going to have a socialism based off of 2 sectors of the workforce, though, is kind of wild. Someone shoot that reactionary. Yeah, so you have 75% participation in teachers' unions, and that they are in a mild decline. Mostly because it looks like what they do increasingly is unions have steadily amped up their political involvement. Teachers' unions, political donations have grown from 4.3 million to 32 million. 94% of their funds going to Democrats. Now, dues do not go towards union donations, but there you go. Was the ideological makeup of teenagers hope that union affiliation has political implications? The ideological affiliation of teachers is the exact same as their education level. It depends on the state and how many of those teachers hold higher level degrees. The ideological identification of teachers' unions is overwhelmingly Democratic. However, for example, in Utah, the teachers' union tends to vote with the police union more than it votes with the AFL-CIO. 94% of its donation funds. It is not where its dues go. Keep that honest. But yes, most of what I hate to say this, but most of what the union bureaucracy does is generate funds for political parties that don't give anything back to them. You're going to use that to build a socialist coalition off of? Here's some other interesting things. Both the teachers' unions have been sketchy on vaccine mandates. This hasn't even got me on. I was going to talk about Biden's vaccine mandate, but I'm not going to do that today. It's 94% of donation funds, but it's a huge amount of money. Now, here's what's worrying about the left strategy. And I'm going to quote to Michael Lind again, because again, I was asked, what do I agree with Michael Lind on? Since I said I agree with part of it, he actually makes the exact same point as Christopher Lasch, on this point right here. The weakness of populism is that it is literally reactionary. Populists react against what the dominant overclass does, rather than having a positive or constructive agenda of its own. Michael Lind. And the overclass, according to the overclass is a political fight, you know. So someone asked me about the YIMBY movement. I'm not sure how effective it's going to be. I mean, what I think would matter is if the YIMBY movement actually does have a stopgap against declines in property value. And that means it would need to have social programs for things like poverty, drug addiction, and stuff like that. And that needs to be handled non-carcerally, obviously. You want as little police involvement as you can in that. Some of it has to do with inclusionary zoning laws. I have not seen a lot of effect of this in California, which is tried to use it. A lot of anti-gentrification has been weirdly lately opposed to to like higher population density, which is also worrying. Which means you're using anti-gentrification rhetoric for NIMBYism. That is a problem when you're only putting in luxury buildings, but yes, in my backyard, as opposed to NIMBY, which is no in my backyard. So YIMBYism is the idea that you can build up support for inclusionary zoning, having multi-economic levels in the same neighborhood, etc. It's been tried in California, New York, and Massachusetts, areas that I may say have some of the highest rents in the country. So I don't know how effective it is. It's also been used in Canada, Slovakia, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. I haven't studied it in other countries outside the US, and I'm not going to do it on air. I'm already having to try to make sure I get all my stats correct, since some of my stat sources have been manipulated already. Do you think fringe movements can successfully act as no, I do not. I'm just going to say that right now. The idea that all this is to push the mainstream towards the left and electoral calculus, allowing left-wing parties to... allowing left-wing parties to look more centrist. I don't think it's working. While there is a certain subset of youthful people who are very online, who are very into, quote, radical ideas in both directions, honestly. More left and right, but in both directions. There is not a lot of evidence that has had anything at all effective on a stalemated political calculus in the entire setup of the United States. Like, guys, this using ETS as an OSHA to push a vaccine mandate that will likely be overturned and probably have legal consequence for the federal government being able to intervene in healthcare in the future, is being done because they can't pass any laws of any significance. I mean, I could go into the specifics in the Biden case, but like when I'm reading liberals defend this, they often bring up Supreme Court laws about states enforcing vaccine mandates, as long as they have exceptions for religion and disability. But the OSHA mandate under the ETS law hasn't even explained who's paying for what yet. It will be opposed. There's like almost every Republican governor in the country, and there's more Republican governors than Democratic ones, are itching for an ability to sue over that, even if they want the vaccine to be widely accepted. I would say they did. The AFL-CIO merged. They did not merge into neoliberalism. It didn't exist yet. They merged into neo-Fordism, but whatever. I don't mean to be mean, but these categories actually matter. And most people use neoliberalism when they should say capitalism, or they should actually get their periodization right. Neoliberalism, specifically, as per Morawski and a few others have been clear, was an attempt to financialize assets and create markets by force instead of, markets are always created by governments, actually, but like to create markets and public-private partnerships in which you have to participate. It's a marketization of a trend one already saw about the government intervening and trying to use capitalism, and capitalism trying to use it, neo-Fordism is its own thing, but it was a way to try to, our healthcare system is actually the responsibility of neo-Fordism more than even just pure capitalism, unfortunately. But yeah, the AFL and CLO merge in the capital. That's absolutely true. And yet they're the only, like, unionization is really all we got. I mean, this has been like, my point is, a lot of the concerns that I hear from socialists outside of Medicare for all betray that they are on the low end of the average worker. I mean, you look at the stats for the DSA. It was neither the DSA income was higher than the average income. It still mostly paralleled the urban working class spread of income variance, but it's very urban. It makes slightly more money than average, although not a lot more. But I don't know. We looked at what its class origins were. Yeah. Neoliberalism is not just capitalism. It is a specific form of capital where, here's the issue though. Capitalism as government non-intervention in markets has pretty much never existed. I mean, you think about the enclosures, that's a governmental project. I'll listen to that. I actually think a lot of people need to unlearn their Marxists too, because Marx is taught so poorly. I also don't know that I think Marx is correct on everything. Marxism as a racial thesis is not proven out. Whether or not Marx believed it after 1860 is actually unclear to me, but he definitely believed it before that. Yep, I would actually agree, spiritual manlet. They make more than a national average, less than the local average, but they're concentrated in rich urban areas. And not just urban areas, specifically rich urban areas, New York, California. So the whole downwardly mobile thesis does seem to be correct. Okay, so I'll read the interview. All right. So in addition to our figures, we have the fact that we have a Congress that can't do anything, and we want to get Medicare for all through it somehow. I mean, most of my fans know how likely that is, but my God. Yeah, of course. Almost all. I mean, from the enclosures to the railroads, almost all of it involves government. It's nothing else, legal involvement. You don't have property without laws. One of the things I've been fascinated. So here's this fascinating paradox on conservative temperament that we've seen in the research on conservative temperament. And notice I said contemperament, not ideology. So I actually do take Haidt's. It's self-selected. There are major problems with it, but Jonathan Haidt's research on temperamental liberalism and conservatism, and its overlap with substantive liberalism and conservatism is somewhat true. Because it comes out in the United States like consistent over and over and over and over and over again. They don't agree with you on who the ruling class is, Keith. So ask yourself a question, though. I mean, Keith has a point. Why the left can't target the ruling class and the racial elite? Why can't, for example, you really go after the military budget? That's a pretty elite thing. Like, the last few wars have moved trillions of dollars from public into private hands through the military, into the military budget. Why can't we go after that? We talk about it sporadically, but usually in terms of campism, not in terms of anything substantive. Critical support for China or whatever. That's one. Most of these sectarian groups, the critical support doesn't matter. That is a hangover of the Soviet Union and people LARPing something that, but people LARPing what people were LARPing about 40 years ago. I think the biggest elephant in the room on the military budget is that I don't think the left has looked at what the non-rich urban areas are like and how dependent they are on the military budget and why that would be so hard to cut. And when they do, they get afraid. Well, the question is like, why don't you focus on it locally even? Like, why is that such a deadpan issue locally? You could put pressure campaigns on local issues to do it. And the reason why you don't is because in a lot of those areas where it would be a vital issue, it would also dry up cities. Military Keynesianism was a good plan. Now, it's dying. When I say it was a good plan, it was a good way to keep public investment in the military. But it's dying. It's totally dying. Military Keynesianism is the idea that the military would have a social safety net like a social democratic thing. So the VA, wage gaps, decent, better disability benefits, support for spouses, publicly provided housing, and then lots of government funding in R&D and surrounding areas. So that's been expanded into various contracting. That's why so much public money's gone into private hands in these wars. You think about what happened with Bernie, for example. Bernie had a crisis where he supposedly, wanted to fight the military-industrial complex. But when it came to actual manufacturing in Vermont, he would not. He would support the contract in the manufacturing of munitions in Vermont for workers' reasons. We don't even get that far. There is a question is, what if we poured all this money into infrastructure, housing, and healthcare? I believe that one of the things that I hate to say it, but Daniel Besner brought up on American Prestige podcast is that there is a truth to the fact that NATO has been, somewhat funding European in social democracy by reducing their expense and in defense for their enforced trade networks. So, if you were to take all that money that went into defense, so let's just say half of it. Like, let's say you accept the need for a standing army. I'm not sure that I even do, but let's just say you do. And you just cut it in half. Well, why don't you? Like, the elephant in the room is like the U.S. military secures U.S. dollar trade, right? And so many of the social programs that you built on are dependent on U.S. dollar trade. There's a real sense in which this is, and this most of these social programs are somewhat dependent on imperialism. And yet, you know, people might say that in abstract, but they don't deal with it in concrete ways. I'm not sure that imperialism is good for the average American, actually, anymore. It may have been in the 50s. The problem that you have is that there's no way that the Democratic Party is going to do much about that. That elite, that coalition of democratic ownership, the ultra wealthy and the poor. Well, I bet you if we look at that we'll see that the ultra wealthy's agenda dominates more than the poor's does. So any left that tries to operate within those auspices from an insider-outsider strategy, and the insider-outsider strategy in regards to the Democrats, to me, just always strikes me as like just blatantly like, we're going to betray you, but we're going to say it up front. And that's dumb. Like, why would you ever do that? Like, you would have to, you could not advertise a dirty split or anything like that, or even a break from the Democrats. And the DSA, for all that it says it wants to, doesn't seem to actually want to, has no idea. Yeah, and you're right. Many people in the military are there because they pay, and the benefits for the family of four are almost impossible to match in the private sector, even for those with bachelor's degrees. Actually, I would say even for some of those with graduate degrees. And it offers up to you a bunch of contracting that's kind of gross, but is what it is. So I want you to think about this phrase, and the function of something is what it does. The DSA saved the center of the Democratic Party because there was no. I know that Doug Lane, my friend Doug Lane, likes to blame the left for everything because that still makes the left important, right? Like the left is important if it's the reason why everything failed. But what if it just didn't really exist? Even in its explosion of popularity online, it never existed in the right places with the right kinds of people. The Dems own local politics in certain cities. They don't own local politics in most states. That's a big problem if you wanted to use Dems for progressive policy. And when the Dems lose, let's say you have a DSA chapter actually take a local apparatus, which has happened. What happens immediately? DSA just will let that Democratic chapter die. You're not going to find allies by pivoting to the right or to the Democratic Party. You're just not. Like, even if people ideologically agree with you, who actually controls the apparatus of the party? Who has the ability to enforce things? The DSA doesn't. So what does it do? What is this function? Why, even if every person in the DSA is totally acting in good faith and nobody's a grifter, and I don't know one way or the other. But let's look at that. I'm not going to talk about the expansion of the MPC as a paid position because it doesn't pay a lot. It does pay, but it doesn't pay a lot. I think it pays $2,000 a month. I'm not going to talk about the fact that something like 40% of the DSA's national funding goes into consulting, which is unclear where that goes. I'm not going to talk about the fact that Bernie may have saved the Democrats as much as they hate him and want to bury him. They also don't. In fact, he's been kind of rewarded for silence. I don't want to point out the fact that so many of the people who oppose this are obviously on other governmental payrolls and have their own agendas. Ultimately, you have to ask yourself, what are you doing? What is it for? I mean, even the DSA's growth strategy, it grew massively during COVID. I think almost by a little over a third, between a third and half. It jumped from 50 to like almost 90,000, but as COVID has slowed down and as Biden sent them, it's dropped to almost nothing. It's flush with money from a bunch of new recruits that it didn't do anything with, that anyone can tell. Yeah. I mean, we all have our different answers, but what I'm telling you is if you think that this electoral strategy is going to go well for you when you're basing it off of a working class you aren't doing objective class analysis on, electoral strategy where you have no accountability mechanism, electoral strategy you have that your base is very regional, electoral strategy where it might be made up of downwardly mobile people. That's pretty clear, but it's not very representative of the general population. It's also poorer than the non-representative area that it lives in. Well, I mean, the left have reached mass audiences, and that the word socialism now can mean any number of things, and people don't recoil from it in the same way unless you're over 40. But it also doesn't do much. I mean, it's not scary. I mean, people aren't afraid of socialists. Not really. The problem is with everyday people, you'd actually have to deliver on things, and maybe you need a state level and a local level strategy to do that. But then it's going to vary on the area, and also the problems are not even national now; they're international. And I don't say this to like make you guys lose hope, but I'm tired of hearing things that are just not true. Like, there's a large working class. Well, yeah, there is. The working class is 80% of the population. But like, it's not the same. There's no mystical like 99% versus 1%. That's not what most people experience. The 1% are so removed, you don't even know if they care about politics anymore. So yeah, that's why I agree with Michael Lynn. What I disagree with Michael Lynn is I don't see the working class. I don't see it as a battle between having to pick between these elites, because I don't think a petty bourgeois society is going to be a whole lot better. Nor do I think it's possible, frankly. I don't think we can. I think that there's the racial stuff is a proxy for a bunch of stuff right now. I think housing. I think housing issues would be huge. I think we've been pitching this Medicare for all, and the ADA just keeps getting. We can't even fix the ADA, guys. which, by the way, I thought was a sham deal from the beginning. So, because it made a lot of people's health insurance worse, it made some people's better, but the people's it made better varied by the state they were in. So it was never going to be A, popular, and B, very effective. And C, it was a giveaway to the insurance companies because there's no price controls. That's how they got on board. And I haven't even begun to touch on climate change, which is really huge. Literally, for the past 3 months, I walk out to fire smoke. All right, but who are the socialist outlets? The biggest socialist media outlets, by the way, are run by people with ties to New Yorker, people with ties to trust funds. I mean, it really the dominant, which is not to say that they're necessarily automatically bad, but there is a sense in which the dominant media landscape of the left that's popular. You can go to Barnes and Noble and buy their magazines. They were all trust fund people, or they have media parents, are they literally Ivy League educated. That's not the media milieu we wanted. Yeah, the ACA, yes. Excuse me, the American Health Care Act. Obamacare sucked. We can't even fix Obamacare. The Affordable Care Act, yes. Oh, as far as political actors, you don't have anybody in the United States. I mean, you have like 6 candidates, all of whom seem. Ilhan Omar seems to have some principles. But not. I mean, even those are kind of thin. But my point is, like, you have a bunch of people play acting that they're, you know, how much of this whole, you know, extreme socialist move that you see on Twitter and on Facebook and social media is a cope for the fact that this doesn't work. And that a lot of the things that people were so guys, the media landscape, the emergence of the anti-left, the emergence of all these songs, it comes out of 2019 for a reason. But I don't know why anyone thought 2019 would work, except they were huffing their own fumes. I have people telling me, you know, you're going to have an answer to the border problem, and you are, right? But if you think these nations, like, if you think that things are going to get hard now, they're only going to get harder because the great movement of peoples has already begun. There's no adults in the room. There's no one who I can even imagine to become the adults. Who's the leadership of this movement? You want union leaders to do it? Have you met them? Do you think the leaders of left media are going to be good for us? Dual power would imply that you had the ability to build an alternate social system to the government. Do you have the ability to do that? And I don't mean we're running small mutual aid networks. I'm not opposed to that. All right. I think it's a good thing, but like dual power, like, come on. You're not the Muslim Brotherhood, and they couldn't do it. Yes, and that is a point. I will actually side with Keith. I won't frame it in the same class framework he did, but if mutual requires everyone participating, if everyone's not participating and collaborating, then it's charity. Anyway, it's been 2 hours. I gotta go do other stuff.